we will outlive like the current definition of ADHD.
My strengths in this particular area mean that I have a struggle in this area.
I can't get myself to focus on something for 25 minutes. Can I get myself to focus on something for 5?
You talk about the idea of reimagining education in general, and I'm really curious to know what that looks like.
I always sound like a crazy person when I talk about this topic.
Hello, everyone. Today, I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing you to Brandon Hendrickson. Brandon is the founder of Science is Weird, a sprawling online science course that helps kids fall in love with the world. He also has a Substack, The Lost Tools of Learning, where he is reimagining what education can be. Two really great topics, so I'm very excited to talk learning with Brandon today. Welcome.
Thank you so very much for having me on, Sky.
Yeah. Well, let's start by just talking a little bit about you. You have ADHD. Take us through when you found out. What was that process like for you?
I think I ran across the idea that maybe I could have ADHD when I was an adult. I ran across, what's the name of that book by John Ratey and Ned Hallowell? Driven to Distraction.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, found it at a used bookstore, and I'm always buying books and reading books. And I ran across it, and I don't do horoscopes, but I have some friends who do. And I'm always sort of rationally critical of this. But my goodness, I understand when they talk about but you don't get it. I just am a Leo. I can't help it. It's just the perfect fit for me. And that's definitely the experience that I had reading that book. This actually explains all of the good and bad things in my life. But I grew up, I think in the 90s, at least in the States, there was this pushback against having the idea that ADHD was really being overdiagnosed, and, it's the newest sort of moral panic. And so I was really resistant to the idea that this was a proper category to describe myself, especially since I did fine in school.
Yeah.
And then I entered graduate school, and graduate school was pure pain. Weirdly, it was in the topic that I was the most interested about anything in my entire life, education. And it was, I think, because the readings that we had to do were just so boring and seemed pointless that I just had such a difficulty that I finally went to my general practitioner and said, "Hi, I would like to have a conversation with you about, this is going to sound really weird, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder." And he laughed and said, the very first time that I had met you, I was actually looking on my clipboard of that's weird, because obviously this guy has ADHD, but I don't think I saw an ADHD diagnosis on here, which was really nice for me to hear that. In the States, it's really hard to get, depending on the throw of the dice, it can be really hard to get a diagnosis or to get a doctor to do almost anything. And so there was a lot of paperwork that came between me and actually getting a formal diagnosis. And
ironically,
it's almost like the proof that you have ADHD is that you can't get an ADHD diagnosis.
A lot of people have said that, yeah.
Too blithe, but my goodness. So it took me a few extra years for that. And then I finally got the diagnosis, and that has been very helpful to be able to, I'll even say, brandish that as a useful tool to say, no, this thing that I'm talking about that's really hard for me, you should take this seriously. I'm not just saying this because I'm lazy and I'm trying to get you to do my work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is the thing. When you don't have a name for something, it can just be considered to be a flawed personality trait. I mean, going back to your horoscopes conversation, I think that's one of the reasons why we like those things.
And I have so very many flawed personality traits, right? It's this constant question of this thing that I'm doing that's driving me crazy and is driving my wife crazy and is driving my kids crazy. All of my kids have ADHD, but it's driving my kids crazy too. Is this something that I can make sense of with my ADHD diagnosis? Or is this just one of the 1,000 other aspects of myself that is truthfully quite maddening? It can provoke a lot of doubt too. I imagine you've experienced people who very confidently will point to something that, I don't know, makes them who they are, positive or negative, and say, well, because I'm ADHD, blank. And you can look, I have a DSM handbook somewhere around here. You can look through the DSM and find that a lot of these personal characteristics that people are talking about are not actually part of the official diagnosis. Excuse
Yeah.
me, this is a question that I've had for a long time. New Zealand, DSM territory or something else?
No, New Zealand is DSM. New
Okay.
Zealand is DSM territory. Our system is pretty similar in terms of diagnosis, and similarly long and complicated and expensive to get that diagnosis. But it's interesting that, this idea of what is in the DSM, what isn't in the DSM. I mean, me and my co-host are always talking about this because we've got the research recaps around this idea of like, I want to know what the next DSM is going to include, because there is a combination. Sometimes, people say, oh, well, this is me. And you're like, I don't know, like this might be a combination of things. After all, we are a bit of a cloud of things. But also, especially when it comes to emotional regulation and things like that, there's a lot of research to say that that is in ADHD more now and maybe should be in the DSM, but they haven't given us number 6. So we wait.
Do we know when that's actually due to be out?
I don't even know if there's a date at this point. Like, I mean, we're just going on a slight tangent here. So, but if I was the people who write the DSM right now, I would be very nervous about the idea of updating it because it's currently set in stone. I feel like we live in a world of so much research and information, and maybe that's just the little area that I'm in right now. So I'm not seeing it elsewhere. But yeah, it is going to be interesting how they will navigate it.
I teach a course on neurodiversity as a science teacher. And one of the really interesting things for me in looking at the history of these things is to recognize that, what we call ADHD now comes from the 2013 or 2011 or whatever, first release of DSM-5.
Yeah, not very long.
Yeah. And before that, it was like the diagnosis was a little bit different. I'm forgetting whether it was the 3 or the 4 that had ADHD as the default, not ADHD as the default. But before that, right, it was, oh gosh, I'm going to forget this, a hyperkinetic disorder, I think. And before that, it was minimal brain dysfunction, if I'm remembering my history properly on that. And like recognizing that these theories that we have for what is going on, these ways that we kind of clump together, things that on the surface seem so different, like how much attention one can pay in different ways and how active one is. Like if anything, as my science advisor pointed out to me in preparation for this last course, you'd think that those things would be oppositely correlated, that somebody who would have, just need a lot of movement and action would also have really good attention.
Yeah.
And the fact that these really do statistically clump together is actually really weird. And then to read that various big theorists of ADHD have different theories and actually disagree and say, it probably shouldn't be attention. It should be boredom. It should be, I'm forgetting what what Russell Barkley chunks it up as, right? But everybody has their own takes on this and recognizing we will outlive the current definition of ADHD.
We will. And it's one of the reasons our organization is called Unconventional Organization, not something with ADHD in the name on purpose. Because I wasn't, I've always expected that it might change because that's how it works. Like you said, it's changed a lot in the DSM, and also because all of these things, they have a history. And when you look back, it is a lot of people just being like, okay, we're going to group this thing together. And we're going to hope that there's neurological underpinnings that we find in a couple of years. And then sometimes they do, and then sometimes they don't. And there's debate and theorists. I could talk about that forever. That was my whole academic career.
That was a really sage move of yours, whether or not that pans out. Nice job.
Thank you. Well, I asked people a lot, unconventional, because that's what it is. We're unconventional. And for you, I think unconventional learning is a thing that you do. So take me through, what is it about learning that appeals to you?
One of the sort of mysteries when I got my diagnosis was, why wasn't this spotted in childhood? I think there's some debate as to whether ADHD can arise in adults. But what I realized looking back at every single piece of my childhood is that I was terrifyingly bored by everything that we did in school. And my way of what I refer to as self-medicating was to just get books. And what I was doing was chasing the shiny. I would fall in love with the topic of whales. I would fall in love with the Titanic. I would go really Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and dinosaurs. I don't think I've ever actually let up on dinosaurs. But all sorts of weird little things, military aircraft. And just learn the heck out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I then fell in love with teaching, I guess, randomly at some point in college when I needed something to throw my life into.
Mm-hmm.
One thing had failed me and it was time for another. And I ran across a book on teaching that kind of threw the gauntlet down and said, schools are terrible. There's a complicated answer to that question.
Yeah.
But I recognized that I had always loved learning because I had seen everything in the world as being shiny. And so when I, started tutoring and started teaching classes, like the thing that I was trying to do, even from the beginning, was trying to be this bridge between my students and the coolest possible things in the world. Which it turns out, like, if you can even do that a little bit, is like a good way of getting a reputation as a really good teacher, or at least a really interesting teacher. So I really launched myself into really trying to get to the bottom of education and trying to, solve the learning crisis. When I realized that not all of that many other people in education are aware that the world is so shiny, that there is almost nothing in the world that could be really called boring when you get to the bottom of it. And so my work since then has been try to figure out methods of helping almost anybody lead almost anyone into a deep and emotional and cognitive connection with almost anything.
That's so interesting. And so do you think that there are differences in how we make those connections with ADHD versus without?
I think that there are so many differences in people, and ADHD versus not ADHD is one of them, that there's going to be, for any given ADHD person and any given non-ADHD person, normies, I like to call them, there's far more differences that don't have to do with ADHD. I think that the one crucial thing with ADHD is that we have a smaller capacity to deal with things not pulling us in. Unless we have motivation externally, internally, right, whatever, and I'm not saying that those are both equally good, but unless we have that kind of motivation, we are just going to flail and usually fail at what we're doing. And so I feel like we are the canaries in the coal mine of
this is boring.
Yes, of this is boring and this shouldn't be boring. And I think oftentimes I talk about that and it's like I think I can come across as like, let's make everything shiny and interesting, but really like the most dependable way of making things work for all kinds of learners is to not stand on top of a desk and wave our arms around or to, educational people will sometimes describe broccoli dipped in chocolate. This attempt to like, let's take this boring topic and let's make it fun, right? I sort of shudder internally to when I hear things like that. The most universalizable way of helping everyone, especially those of us with ADHD who need it most, to engage with, to enter into, to be pulled into a topic is to show not just how it matters, but not just like to make it fun, not how it could matter to them, but how it has mattered to lots of people in the past. That the things that we actually want to communicate to students, the skills that we want to teach them, the content that we want them to learn actually has mattered before and can matter again.
Hey, you listening to this podcast. If you like what we do and you want to hear more of it, there is one way to make sure that happens. Please go ahead, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We have been told 5-star reviews can help us to get seen by more people, which means more people are going to learn about ADHD strategies.
Just press the button. Just give us a 5-star review.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And, it's funny you mentioned the motivation intrinsic because we recently came across a piece of research that was published this year that focused on that idea, the idea that when they looked at students with ADHD and they compared like achievement goals, like here's a shiny thing that you will get if you achieve this versus like this is something that I'm intrinsically interested in. Yeah, the intrinsic motivation won out.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Interesting. And so you obviously run in the online space, which I'm personally very curious and interested in because I do that as well. And I think a lot of people do now. So what did you do to make your online science courses ADHD friendly? And for the parents here, they're like, yeah, what did you do?
So I've taught high school and college and middle school before, but I happened to be an elementary school teacher at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. And I was in the neighborhood that the first outbreak in North America was found in.
Wow.
My upstairs neighbors worked down the street at the first old folks' home that had the first outbreak.
Oh, wow.
We had worldwide media on our block. And our elementary school, the management of it was from China. And so we were like at the center, like I heard about.
You just woke up and found yourself in the epicenter.
When I heard about COVID first from a fifth grader, like I thought like, this will blow over. This is like bird flu. This is like anything else.
Yeah.
So I think we we tied to be the second elementary school in the United States to close. So we moved to online teaching really early. And one of the things that I found out through just things failing very quickly was that in order to teach online, I needed to have ways of making things even more focused and interesting. I needed to have all these kids who are in their own little rooms and have all their own distractions. I needed some way to bring them together in real time. And reflecting on the educational philosophy that I'd been reading about and working on for a few years, I realized that, I can make every science lesson a riddle. I can ask the kids a riddle at the beginning, and then the end of the lesson can be my unveiling of the answer as a worst case scenario. And as a best case scenario, I can like give them clues and hints, dangle kind of metaphors and stories and weird images to kind of help them like move through this nonlinear process where they together figure out aspects of the answer. And so now I've done hundreds of these lessons, and I'm going through the whole science curriculum right now, the whole third grade through eighth grade science curriculum, making all of this, and they're cool. We find that when we teach like that, we can get kids engaged from the very first moment because they're boring questions in the world, right? Like, what is the chemical formula for something? Who knows? Who cares? It will be a great answer to them. Whereas something like, what is the solar system? Right? Everybody knows what the solar system is, obviously. And then, so I take their answers at the beginning and then I say, nope, that's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong. And then like the revelation that this riddle leads to is this sort of totally new way of thinking about the solar system that is totally scientifically accurate, but totally blows apart all of their concepts, their astronomical concepts that they picked up from TV shows and their parents in school and whatever. That sorry, is that a good answer to a riddle and revelation?
That's a great answer. Yeah, it's you're taking them on a journey.
Yes, very much so. Yeah,
and that's interesting because when you think about online learning and you think about all those ways of thinking, it can feel very the same because you are almost in the same format a lot. You're like looking at a screen and this person is talking to you, and it sort of doesn't matter how many times you jump up and down because you're still on this little box.
Yeah.
So taking them on a mental journey, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And hard. That requires you to have planned what you are going to say, which I know because I used to teach for a very long time, is not always, the case. And not everyone has done that when they teach a class.
The way that I've found now that I teach this is that I teach the same lesson 5 times in a week. And the first time it's, I have like a bunch of notes written on like 8 different papers scattered around my desk, and I'm looking around and I'm drawing things, and I am just dead at the end of it. And, when I succeed, and usually I succeed at that lesson, I've landed the plane. We've all survived. We've gotten to the answer. But then I go back through and I gut the entire thing and I put it together in a better order. And then I do that a few more times before I teach the final lesson. And then I can teach with my eyes closed. I think actually maybe one of the advantages to doing it like this in this sort of planned to be interactive way is that the first time that I teach it, I can almost underplan it because the kids, I'll only know when the kids ask me their questions. Oh, you actually misconceived of the thing that I said. Oh, I see. You were actually assuming this totally different thing the entire time. All right. Let's talk about that, which is wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So I guess, are there any challenges that you had because, a lot of people had to switch to online, and you have maintained that switch on some level. So are there any challenges that you've had building that system?
I mean, I think that I didn't have a system at the beginning, and now I now I have a system. I've been doing this for, I think I just finished 4 years of doing this. And now the system doesn't change particularly much at this point. But it was every lesson for the first year or two, I was always figuring out new tricks and ticks, and I can't think of the word there, to modify it. So, I iterated my way to a stable system that I'm really happy with now.
Was there any moments where you were like, "Ooh, this is actually not how I expected this to be perceived because it's a digital format"? Were there any of those moments for you?
I don't think so. Do you have any ideas in mind for that?
I think when I first started the online courses, like way, way back, there was an online community, for example, that came with it. They were like, open this online community and send a message, and then everybody who's joined your online course will come streaming in and respond. And I was like, yeah, okay, let's send the message. And then no one came. I think one person came because we just didn't have a good flow between the lessons and the things that were coming through and the actual thing. So we had to learn. And this is, I think, maybe a particular ADHD thing. When you're working with neurodiverse audience, it feels like everything has to be like built from the ground up with a flow to support the people that are in it.
I think that the first few weeks, I was so flailing at what I was doing that I had to build it all up. And I suspect that I've repressed all of those memories.
That makes sense. You were working in like a frenzy of just like, this has to work. We have to make this thing.
I used to be doing 5 days a week, a new lesson a day, twice a day.
Wow.
I don't know how I did that. I mean, that was just was not sustainable. And so I think I don't have very many memories from that period of my life. Now I get this much more leisurely. I mean, it's not leisurely. I work myself to death during the school year. But I get to hone every danged detail of it to make sure that the thing flies beautifully by the end. And I bring these students through this, like at the beginning of what I was doing, it was enough for me if at the end of the lesson, the students hadn't unmuted themselves a dozen times and made fart noises or something. Now what I go for at the end of every lesson is to have, at least one or two students literally like see their jaw drop when they realize that, like with the final piece of the revelation at the end, that like they've been totally misconstruing some aspect of reality the entire lesson in their entire lives. So I feel like I've just gotten so much better at sort of engaging people in this sort of interactive theater of learning.
It's like you said, I think it's that idea of just continually iterating. That's kind of been a big part of it, just being able to just develop, and that iteration has been part of what creates it.
I was in the startup community for a long time before this. And so I think I came into this kind of teaching, this part of my teaching life, with the iterate, fail faster. I mean, I sometimes worry that I'm not failing enough now, that there's learning to be had that I could be gaining from, and that things are too easy for me.
Yeah. Well, this actually brings me to you because I want to talk about you for a minute.
Oh, no.
You're about to be pinned down. So what does a day in your life look like? Take me through that.
So right now I'm in the first actual summer vacation since like 20 years. In the last 20 years, my wife has let me just take off of teaching for the whole summer so I can write a book. So right now my life is glorious, and I wake up every morning. It's hard to go to bed every night because I'm so excited about what I get to do the next morning. So can I answer that question? Not for this, not for that, but rather for
sure. Let's talk about a time which isn't blissful, and then maybe we'll touch on the blissful.
So I wake up on Friday morning and I prepare to meet with my science advisor to plan out the lesson for the whole next week. And we've done a bunch of planning about this over the summer before and the weeks beforehand. And then we have like in the afternoon, like this grueling and wonderful, but grueling 2-hour-ish long conversation where we really just like explore all of the nooks and crannies that could possibly be had and whatever the topic is, snails, evolution, or whatever, right? That we're going to be talking about the next week. So I prepare myself for that, and then I do that. I have an actual kind of weekend where I work on other sort of projects. On Monday morning, then, I wake up and I drag myself out to my local beloved coffee shop, and I lay out every idea that I've had for this lesson. And then I cram those ideas into a rough outline by actually, just as we were talking about iterating on this, like by setting a timer for 5 minutes and saying, okay, like just write down like what I think I want to do in this lesson. I have all these notes. What do I think I want to do? Okay. Timer goes off. Start the timer again. Okay, so now I have this, like, let's just try that again from scratch. Having gone through this, like, what do I want to do now in this lesson? Okay, now I come up with a slightly better version of it. Some things are flipped around. I've killed some things. I've brought some new things in. I've realized that, oh my gosh, there's this deeper question to answer. Set a timer now for 10 minutes. Okay, what do I want to do in this lesson from scratch? And every time that I do this, I'm evolving this. I'm making it better. I'm seeing things that I missed before. That's so exhausting. And it's so hard to keep myself to this that I actually have this whole system that I use that actually is the same system that I use at all times too to get all of my work done. Can I tell you a story?
Yeah.
I was in graduate school and I had this 5-page paper that I was due on Monday. It was Saturday morning, and I knew from past experience that I could pump out a 5-page paper if I had 5 hours of unadulterated focus. A good paper in that amount of time. So I sat my butt in a coffee shop and I just sat at my computer, and 5 hours later, it was beautiful. 5 hours later, I had done every single thing except for start the stupid paper.
That is a relatable story.
I was furious at myself because I knew the next day my wife and I had been planning to go out on a picnic with our year-old son at the time, now 14. And I knew like I just killed our picnic. So the next day I sat down and I told myself like, I cannot screw this up again.
Yeah.
And so like, I felt like, how can I avoid this? I knew about the Pomodoro method of the 25 minutes and all of that. I think I tried that the day before. I tried that in the past, and sometimes it had worked and sometimes it hadn't. But this paper was just, it was just too boring. It was just such a boring paper to write. Like it wasn't enough. And I thought, okay, I can't get myself to focus on something for 25 minutes. Can I get myself to focus on something for 5? I don't know. Okay, I need there to be stakes in this. And I was like learning about a bunch of like, Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow and behaviorism and cognitive psychology. And, these are the things I've been like learning on my own before I got to graduate school. I said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes and I'm going to write down physically the thing that I want to do.
Support your working memory. I love that.
Yes, like vomit out something so I I can like offload it from my working memory. So I don't have to like hold the thing to do and how to do it, right? Like I have the
100%.
working memory of a goldfish, right?
We all do with ADHD.
Yeah, right? Like just like bonks against the glass time and time again. What's going on? And then at the end of that 5 minutes, I said, I will either take a bite of this donut or Danish or whatever it was, or if I fail, I will slap myself in the back of the hand, which I will say that like you have no pain receptors in the back of your hand, but it's really weird being that guy at a coffee shop who's slapping himself.
Yeah, the peer pain receptors of the social consequences are high.
So highly tuned. So by the end of 3.5 hours, I had finished the 5-page paper. I had gotten halfway through the donut because it turns out that you get sick of a donut if you eat it really slowly. And I'd never slapped myself on the back of the hand once.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have since honed this methodology to run large sections of my life. So like every morning, this was with mornings.
I'm looking at a note that says run far with one problem /solution.
So at the top, there's that title, and that is like, what is the one big thing that I want to do during this deep work session, what I call a hyper-focused session. You can see a bunch of these on the left-hand side actually going back. You can see them going back years, actually.
Yeah.
And then below that, I write down, or this morning I wrote down kind of my metacognition thing. Like, let me just like step away from the individual tasks and talk about like, just like kind of think out loud through typing. because then I can think, right? I just like sort of feel freed to think. I don't have any intrusive thoughts, right? I can control the intrusive thoughts because it's what I'm writing down. I can write a thing down and it will just be there and then I can think about it. And then I go into like my first, what I call a burst now, where I set a specific amount of time, still usually 5 minutes. Sometimes it's longer than that. Sometimes it's shorter than that. Then I just say like this one thing to do. I do these spaced repetition flashcards. And then at the end of those, this time 5 minutes, I write down, for me, my code is 1 check. If I kind of did it, but I didn't do it as well. I didn't just focus on that one thing. And then I write down a little feedback for myself after that. And then you can see the next thing here is 5 minutes and then another sort of little instruction, a little order for myself. I find it so much easier to give orders and take orders than I do to sort of like drive in the moment when I can do both of those.
100%. Driving is the executive functioning, essentially. So if you can stop and you can think, and that's giving yourself the executive functioning order, and then you can just take executive functioning order, it is helpful.
One of the things that I stumbled across, a lot of like the educational philosophy that I'm developing comes from out of Canada, a guy named Kieran Egan. It holds that that there was this cognitive revolution that happened for humanity when we evolved simple enough alphabets that most people could be taught to read them, right? Cuneiform did not cut it. Hieroglyphics did not cut it. The Phoenicians cut it. And honestly, even the Greek then was actually even a little bit better because they included vowels and the Phoenicians didn't. But usually when scholars, like historians of information theory, they talk about this, they talk about the long-term memory that writing allows us to do. We can, spread ideas for years that were hatched in, the fluid flesh of someone's head and move it over, miles or hundreds of miles. But I realized doing this that the effect of writing on working memory is at least as revolutionary.
Yeah. Take me through what you mean by that.
Instead of trying to have thoughts and do the thoughts and to follow my thoughts, I can just bracket time to let whatever ideas pop into my head come to my head, and I can write them down. And then I can choose what to do. And then I can set a timer, and I use a bunch of different kinds of timers depending on where I am. And then I can do them. And this is definitely exaggerating it. It feels like at no point am I really taxing my executive functioning. I'm just letting my brain do its own little squirty new idea brain thing method. And then I'm capturing it. And because I have this method to follow, I don't even usually need to think about like, what am I going to do? Because I can spend 3 minutes in a timer to say, what should I do next? It's just my brain squirting. Now, that ends up not being true. And I suppose in some ways it's totally false because of what I said a few minutes ago with when I'm doing these iterations of making lessons, I'm just it's so exhausting. But it's so exhausting because I am pushing my executive functioning to and beyond its limit to try to take these like dozens of really cool science ideas and put them together in terms of importance and model the minds of my students and what it is they don't know yet, and then try to impose or try to find the narrative structure that's sort of implicit in these things, and then kind of put these things together. That's just so much work to do that it ends up being exhausting. But the actual like the kind of controlling myself and figuring out what work to do, that is almost 0% of the work that I do anymore. So
yeah, that's great. That's awesome. That's very cool. What I hear you talking about is this idea of kind of we're up here often with, we've got a lot of things going on. We might be on our phone. We might be on the couch. We're sort of like not doing the thing. And we need to get down to a space where we are doing the thing. We are writing the essay. We are doing that kind of thing. And the gap between I'm messaging people, I'm on my phone, and I'm focused and I'm doing a task, I'm in that hyper-focus, like you said, that gap, that jump, if you will, can be physically uncomfortable with ADHD because of our lower dopamine and how it's taken up in our brain. Have you ever experienced that, like almost like physical discomfort that can come from that?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Exactly, right? So what we talk about and what we've developed over a couple of years is building in steps to step down Rather than if you imagine that physical discomfort is like jumping into a cold pool, you might be able to hang out with a friend, maybe a study buddy, and say, okay, we're going to do it together, and you sort of get into it by sheer force of will. But it helps instead to think about, okay, I'm just going to take it one step at a time. And so those steps, what we've sort of developed over iterations with clients is the first step is the dopamine. And it's funny because you mentioned the Danish, and it doesn't have to be Danish. It could be anything. It doesn't even have to be food, but motivating yourself to even get to the space where you're going to start working with some kind of reward, because our ADHD brains aren't going to give you that reward. So you need to kind of give it to yourself. And then after that, we kind of dial down the dopamine a little bit. We might say, okay, well, if your dopamine is like, I'm going to watch a TV show and eat a bunch of, Danishes, then maybe we're going to switch down to a podcast and some Danishes or something like that. And maybe we're going to remove some of the distractions. But the next step is the working memory step, which is what you talked about as well there, which is to say, okay, at this point, I'm going to open my notes app or whatever it is, and I'm going to write down exactly what I'm going to be doing during this period of time. And then from there, it's going, okay, well, let's just open the page. Let's just write a few notes down. Let's just write some headings. And that kind of takes you to the last step. So it's interesting to see these different ways we sort of iterate around this concept, which is getting into focus and getting to work, because it's very interesting.
One of the things that I've really found, and this is to your point of the dopamine, is that I need to see the work that I'm doing as this heroic venture, which is kind of embarrassing to admit, but it helps me so much to be able to do that, which is why oftentimes the titles of these things, right, are these sort of puckish, adventurous, right, like go forth and slay a dragon sort of things.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've found just to get me rolled out of bed on a Monday morning, the hardest morning to go and do this sort of thing, is I have a board that I keep next to my side of the bed. And most nights before I go to bed, I will write down on it what I am most looking forward to doing the next morning. And then the next afternoon, and then the weekend. I like having that sort of like long-term thing that I can keep looking forward to even when bad things are happening. And I keep finding, it's not just teach a fun lesson. I will focus in on some sort of heroic framing of, this aspect of bacteria cognition that I'm going to be explaining to students the next day or something like that. And seeing almost like all of the small tasks that I do are part of like the big lessons. The big lessons are part of like the whole like topics that I explore with kids. The topics are part of like this whole science thing that I do. And the science thing is like toward this, how can I help make a ding in reality that helps mend the world by doing all these things? And the dopamine for me it's exaggerated, it's extended by all of these things fitting together.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it's interesting, the dopamine, because it's probably one of the reasons why with ADHD we can really struggle if we have a boring job. If we have a job where you get to the end of it and you're like, well, the reason that I'm doing this is because, and the answer isn't like, I'm going to improve the world in some way. It can be really, really tough. Some people, they have jobs like that, and I have a real respect for those people. And sometimes they come on the podcast and tell us about that, because that's just, that's really, really difficult.
Yeah. How do they do it?
Sometimes there's another reason. Sometimes there's like a short term, I'm doing this, but long term, my goal is this.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's a family reason. I'm taking care of family. I'm taking care of, things like that. And then sometimes there isn't a really good reason for this moment that we can think of, and we have to just pile on that additional dopamine and say, well, the reason is because when I finished, I get to do something else that's more fun.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But it's definitely harder.
I've worked in lawn care before. I've worked in a metal shop before. And it was, some of the guys who were there, like, it really was their thing. And they were perfectly happy doing the same thing day in, day out, including some smart people even. It was painful.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about, what we've talked about, we've sort of gone on a bit of a journey. We've talked about, obviously, the learning course you've done. We've talked about you, and we've gone into really great detail. If you have a picture or anything, I like to send an infographic to people, kind of talking about what we did. So if you have any visualization of what you explained, I would love that. But I also want to know, you've also got a Substack where you talk about the idea of reimagining education in general. And I'm really curious to know what that looks like. And particularly for ADHD, because I think for a lot of us, education systems, even for those of us who've been lucky enough to do okay in the education system, it's been sort of at a sort of personal expense, if you will, in terms of burnout and things like that. So I'd love to know what you think about reimagining education.
I always sound like a crazy person when I talk about this topic, which is either a sign that I'm in the best possible place that I could be professionally or the worst.
Mm-hmm.
One of the only really good things that happened to me in graduate school is that I happened to run across in an academic library while I was looking for a totally different book, a book called Getting It Wrong from the Beginning, a history of education by this guy who I'd never heard of, a Canadian educational theorist. I read the book and I couldn't fall asleep because I felt like, oh my gosh, this guy, maybe the first person that I've ever read who understands, who feels that all of the things that we want kids to learn in school are actually fascinating if you dig down and then you know how to represent these things to them.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes this just eviscerating history of education where he talks about how we've been ignoring this fact and trying all these other things that just now we look back at it with, the modern cognitive psychology that we have and we say, no, of course that would never work. What the heck were we thinking? And then I found that he didn't just, write criticisms of other people's theories, but wrote his own books. And then he happened to be coming to my university a couple months after that. So I came and met him.
That's nice.
He was lucky, I think. He died a couple years ago. And I realized when I found out that he had died, like, oh my gosh, he's not pushing this forward anymore. There are some other people who are. But I realized, like, man, I'm actually in this situation where I have taught science and I was a kind of a specialist in talking about history and teaching history. And I have been a high-end test prep tutor. And I've taught everything from kindergarten to college. I have this weird spread of subjects and ages. And no one right now is, I think, really working hard to try to figure out what could full schools built on the idea that actually everything is fascinating and that we can get more or less everybody to become really interested in more or less everything, which sounds like a total pie in the sky idea.
Yeah. But what if everything was great?
and I'll say that, right? Like massive success would be moving 20% toward that goal. It would make school much more palatable for a lot of people who just feel like this is not for me. It would help with discipline. It would help with retention. It would help with focus. It would help with everything. And it's not the only improvement in school that needs to be done. But so I was scratching my head shortly after he died, trying to figure out how do I do this? How do I make a really big stand on this? And there's this super geeky blog that's really popular in Silicon Valley called Astral Codex 10 that every year runs a book review contest. And that sounds like a dumb, weird thing. And I love it to death. But I thought I'm going to this year, I'm going to enter the book review contest and I'm going to see if I can place in the top 10. And I ended up winning it, which is definitely the biggest feather I've ever had in my hat before. And people came out of the woodwork, including some actually famous people in the learning science world to connect and talk about how we can work together to make this revolution happen. So now the Substack is how I do that. And I specifically have this chain of posts whereby I have something like 200 different specific patterns of some weird thing that we can do to channel emotions together with cognition in any of the topics for any of the ages. I'm writing a book this summer actually on this topic.
Very cool. Well, I guess my only question with that, and I don't know the answer to this question, that's why I'm curious, is what would you say to people who sort of say, well, the schooling system can't be helped? You know, people who've had such negative experiences, they don't even believe in the schooling system and they're more focusing on like unschooling or those kinds of things that you hear more about now.
Well, I'm a homeschooling dad, so I'll say that I totally understand that.
Yeah.
It's really hard to make a big change in any very large system, be it public, be it private, be it whatever. And so I feel like as a, like inveterate entrepreneur, like my mind immediately goes to, it's the weird experiments on the margins that will really help bring new ideas forward. That said, I haven't given up hope in the large central systems. We've had 120 years of educational reform. There's a really good book about this called Tinkering Toward Utopia that makes the point that we've had all of these attempts. They've tried to pull us in all of these different directions. And maybe the only reform that has actually stuck around is we moved from having desks facing in rows and screwed down into the floor to having desks sometimes in rows and sometimes not drilled down into the floor.
A revelation.
It's in the right direction, probably. That's I think I can say about that. So I feel like people who say, look, like we've tried everything. Like what hope do you have of a new try? And I would say that I put my hope for that in the fact that I'm a fan of modern cognitive psychology.
Likewise.
I'm looking through your stuff. I'm familiar with the stands that you guys take in some things. The assumptions that we've been making these reforms on for such a long time have been based on this view of humans as entirely logical and driven by motivations that are long-term in nature, right? That like I will work really hard because I really want a good grade. I really want to go to a good college. And I'm willing to go through a lot of boredom to get there. The idea is that like motivation is always either intrinsic and therefore totally unguessable and unique, bespoke to every individual, or it is external and like, sort of obvious, sort of clumsy rewards based. And I'm not saying that either of those two things are bad things. Those both can be good things, especially considering the alternative. And that like to help people, what you should do is make things easier or find the right level of difficulty. So Kieran Egan, this guy that I'm spending my life unpacking, he said, okay, look, all of this is being done under the auspices of educational psychology. But just in the same way that we can all agree that anatomy is part of zoology, is part of biology, is part of chemistry, is part of physics, right? Like the natural sciences, they nest, they stack like this. In the same way, we now know that human psychology is a piece of human anthropology. That the way that we, being this very weird type of animal, have evolved is not just to be Vulcans. All school philosophies, be they traditionalist, be they progressivist, they are understanding us as some weird variant of Vulcan.
And by Vulcan, do you want to just define Vulcan for the few people who maybe don't?
Very logical, very individual, very rational, and very like we will do the most good for the most people, and all of that. And I'm not saying that people are wicked or evil or whatever, but like we are groupish, and we are these hairless, clawless, fangless, pathetic apes who have spread ourselves throughout the world and have outcompeted every other animal we've ever tried to compete with. Not because we're so very brilliant in and of ourselves, although we are, we really are. But it's at least somewhat likely that Neanderthals were more intelligent individually than we are. They actually had a higher brain to body ratio than we have, and that's the one thing that we know of that predicts animal cognition, animal intellectual abilities. But the way that we have triumphed be that a bad or a good thing, is by bonding together in groups and learning from one another. We are the animal that doesn't just watch each other and learn, right? Octopuses can do that. Nice job, octopus. But we will actively teach one another. And the ways that we have taught one another, the ways that we have spread information to each other for, 300,000 years and counting, include things like metaphors and include things like songs and include riddles. Actually, there's a deep riddle tradition going on in every culture. You see it pop up in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. And above all, stories. And what all of these things have in common is that they can grab people by the brain and make people pay attention because it triggers these emotional binaries that are in our head, right? Like Toy Story is about belonging versus being abandoned. Jurassic Park is about, on the outside, it's about survival versus being eaten. But on the inside, it's about whether, an old grizzled paleontologist will learn to love kids and get the girl. All movies, all good novels, they're all about these emotional binaries. And a tool like story is able to just slip into our brain, and we can learn so much with a narrative, so much more of the narrative than we ever would through a lecture. These tools that have worked, that have been the tools of humanity's success for 300,000 years, have basically been regulated to being a fun idea that a creative teacher might use in school, in educational philosophy. And what I think we can do, what I do with Science is Weird, what I've done with my other courses, my philosophy courses and world religion courses and math courses, whatever too, is like move these to the center. And what we find when we do this is that it sounds like a distraction, right? Like, oh, you're taking story and you're bringing it to math. Oh, you're wasting kids' time. Maybe it's increasing their motivation. No. It turns out that it revolutionizes everything you teach, and you can bring all sorts of people in a much deeper understanding of just literally how to perform the algorithms, how to understand the concept faster, and it will stick longer when you bring these tools of narrative to it. Here, I'm sorry, this is the crazy person thing about me. I've been yammering. I apologize. What was the question again?
No. It's great. I love it. And I think it's very interesting that you said story is so important, because I think this is worth mentioning for everybody, because a lot of the people that listen to this, they do their own thing in many ways. We're ADHD. We all do our own thing. I'm doing my own thing. You're doing your own thing. And we all have to educate in many ways. We have to educate the people around us in what our unconventional own thing is and why you should let us do it. And, a story in itself isn't just good for learning, but it's also good for that as well. I think that's quite an interesting way of putting it as well.
The most insightful thing that I've ever said about story, in a way that relates to what you just said, have you heard of the Moth storytelling competition?
No.
Okay, so this is maybe just an American thing at this point. It's like TED Talks, except for personal narrative. People will go on a stage, they'll tell a story about something in their lives, and it's a competition. People in the audience vote to see who they liked, whose story they found the best. Then the winners of these are asked to go to a grand slam competition where you get these really good storytellers who are working to polish their stories and make them engaging as possible. So there is one guy who is the all-time Moth Grand Slam storytelling champion. He's a guy named fifth grade teacher named Matthew Dix. He lives on the East Coast of the United States. And he has written a book called Storyworthy that tells how he does it and how everybody can. How to tell a story that avoids the problem that, like you have family and they come back from a vacation to an interesting place. And then, you have to find the opportunity to get up and do something in your kitchen because they're still telling you the story.
Yeah. You're like, I'll be back. Keep going.
It's like, what's the difference between that and like a story that like time like whisks by and you don't even notice it? For him, he says like, it's a moment of transformation. There has to be a change, even a very small one that happens in your life. And then the story is just like how that happened. And then he has a whole bunch of tricks. The book is Storyworthy, highly recommended.
This is the third book you've recommended, by the way. I'm keeping track. I'm writing it down. Yeah. No, it's great. I love it.
I lead groups of people in learning how to do his method. And my gosh, it works. And the thing is, like, once you internalize this, you begin to see these little moments in literally every day's experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And then life begins to become an adventure in a way that it looked like just a bunch of things that happened before. Here's a good TED Talk on this, actually.
Oh, that's awesome.
And when one learns to see this in, the math curriculum or the science curriculum or whatever, the spelling curriculum, my goodness, like the spelling curriculum is full of these little transformative moments, then everything becomes vibrant again.
That's awesome. And speaking of transformation, I have a couple of questions I like to ask everybody at the end. And my first question for you is, tell us about one professional achievement you're the most proud of.
You're going to have to be winning that book review competition.
Yeah, I thought it might be. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about on the other side? What is a personal failure that embarrassed you and how did you deal with it?
Just one, huh? I'm going to just lump together a whole genre of them, which was being part of any number of small startups where it was assumed that because I was clever and could, get a perfect score on the SAT and GRE math sections, that I could definitely schedule something. But I can definitely not schedule anything ever.
Yeah.
And I, like most of the time, I look at a calendar and it's just this swimming soup of live eels that are all kind of reaching out and biting me in the eyes. It's just the most painful thing. And my working memory is toast. And I only see like the threats of, if I try to schedule this here, then what about this? And then this, it's where my very good imagination comes in. And my failures in so many ventures of struggling to explain to co-founders, no, I really shouldn't do this. And all of them saying, oh, no, you're very smart and I'm a very good teacher. I can help you do this. I'm just going which was part of what having the ADHD diagnosis has been really helpful.
Yeah. You're like, no, I've got a doctor's note that says you're not a good teacher.
To this day, if I didn't have that, I don't know what the socially acceptable thing is. Do you have any advice for people on that? Because I feel like my mind goes to, if I try to explain to you how bad, what pain this puts me in right now, or show you the holes in my wall that I have punched by struggling with this.
Gosh, if I was younger, the answer would be cry. Because people are like, well, this is extreme, so therefore it must be different. But yeah, as an adult, I think it really is just standing strong on the idea of look, we all have that spiky profile and mine is high on this, but it doesn't mean it's high on that. How people are different, in different areas, trying to really explain to them that my strengths in this particular area mean that I have a struggle in this area. And maybe even getting them to think about it, especially when you're working with neurotypicals. I always like to say, maybe not too neurotypical, so I don't know exactly how this would work in that context. But, imagine you have to come up with 5 new creative ideas every single day and 3 solutions to a problem. That might be difficult because generally speaking, we know if you're more neurotypical, you might struggle more with creative problem solving because that's a strength of ADHD. But if I asked you to schedule 5 things a day, you'd find that really easy. I'm just the opposite.
I just took notes on that. Thank you. I'll pass that on to people. Yeah, thank you very much for that.
No worries. And then my last question is, if you had an ADHD life motto, what would it be?
I have a life motto, so this is great. And I suppose it is super ADHD. It actually comes from my very favorite quote from Kieran Egan that he wrote in his book, The Future of Education. In school, we represent the world to students as mostly known and rather dull, but the opposite is true. We are surrounded by mystery, and what we know is fascinating.
Yeah.
So that last part of that, we're surrounded by mystery, and what we know is fascinating.
I love that. It reminds me actually of neuroscience. One of the reasons I love it is when I studied it into postgrad level, and one of the reasons was because they said to me, this is the last frontier. And I don't necessarily think that's true, but that was how it was represented to me at the time, was this information is 3 years old, it's too old. The stuff we know is so new. It felt like the space that there was that opportunity to learn and to think. So yeah, I think that's amazing.
This is one of my pieces of advice to my ADHD students is see if you can find an edge or people have not done the cool new thing yet.
Definitely. Also, people don't tell you what to do if it hasn't been done before, which is another thing. People can't tell you that you are doing it wrong. So yeah, it is very, very cool. Well, it's really great to chat with you, Brandon. And I think people are going to love this conversation. Tell them where to find you. Tell them all the things.
Sure. Science is Weird is where I do all the science teaching work. You can stream a lesson for free on there. Would your audience like a code to get the hyperfocus course that I teach, or the
100%? I think that would be lovely. Yeah.
I'd be happy to do that for free. Then the Lost Tools of Learning is my Substack, which can be found at losttools.substack.com.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation. And I can't wait to listen to it again, because I think it's going to be a lot of learning in there, a lot of things, which is unsurprising.
Thank you for being such a danged good job of asking questions. I feel like I really hit a home run in getting you as an interviewer for this. Thank you so much for it.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you for listening, everyone. And a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great, and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discuss, head on over to our show notes page, because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting. And you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.